Hello everyone, thank you all so much for joining us today. Emily Hope and Squux, Waach Elkstwin, the Kamloops Art Gallery. My name is Emily Hope. I'm the Education and Public Programs Director here at the Kamloops Art Gallery. Before we begin today, I'd like to take a moment to situate ourselves. The concept of here is somewhat abstract in these virtual gatherings, but for myself and those of you joining us from the regions surrounding the gallery, here is Kamloops Utlu. I've introduced myself in Squaminchin because that's the language of this land. What we refer to as Kamloops and beyond, spanning over 180,000 square kilometers across the interior plateau of what we call British Columbia, is Secwepem Utluch, the territory of the Secwepem people. It is an immense privilege to be a guest on these lands, and I'm so grateful to my teachers, Jessica Arnoose and Sunny Prairie Chicken, for continuing to make space for me in their classrooms, for their generosity, guidance, and patience. I'm joined today by landscape ecologist Dr. Rachel Holt and the folks from Collective Broadcast who are managing the tech in the background for us. Our program will be about an hour in duration, including some time at the end for questions and conversation. You can submit your questions throughout the talk using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and you're also welcome to chat amongst yourselves and with us through the chat window. I'll begin our program now by reading a brief biography to introduce you to Dr. Rachel Holt. Originally from the UK, Dr. Holt's graduate studies and research in British Columbia fueled her passion for the incredible biodiversity of BC's forest ecosystems. From defining indices of old-growth forests in the field in the 1990s to policy, planning, and cumulative effects assessments for the province of British Columbia and First Nations, Rachel Holt has worked on the ecology and management of British Columbia's old-growth forests in a variety of ways over the last 30 years. She recently co-authored a study on the state of old growth in BC and was a member of the Provincial Ministry's Old Growth Technical Advisory Panel. Dr. Holt was on the Forest Practices Board for 6 years, serving as vice chair for 2 of those. She was also recently an expert witness, testifying on ecosystem conditions and effectiveness of policy in the successful Supreme Court case on treaty rights for the Blueberry River First Nation. Rachel Holt owns and manages the one-woman company Viridian Ecological Consulting Limited. Her goal is to bring transparency to the use of data and science and land management issues in BC, and to move toward a future that considers the full value of ecosystems in decision-making. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Holt. Thank you so much for being here, Rachel.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks for that introduction. I'll just share my screen here. So thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm here on the unceded territory of the Ktunaxa, Sinites, and Okanagan Nations peoples here in Nelson. And thank you to Kelly Richardson, who invited me to participate in this, to support her amazing show that's up at the gallery right now. Unfortunately, my talk is less beautiful. It's just how it goes. But hopefully it resonates in a similar but different way. So I will start. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the state of old growth forests in British Columbia, but I'm also going to put that in a science and policy perspective because that's what I do. So I hope that's what you were hoping I was going to do. I am here talking. I'm trying to make my slides go forwards, which I can't. There we go. So who am I? I'm an ecologist by training. I'm an independent consultant, and I work for myself in my little company, as Emily just said. And mostly what I've done for the last 25 years is work for the provincial government on a variety of things: landscape planning, effects of climate change, old growth, on First Nations issues. I was just recently on a technical panel for the ministers looking at the state of old growth, and it's that context that I'm speaking to you on this work about. And all the technical work that I'm presenting here was done in conjunction with my 2 colleagues, whose pictures are at the bottom there, Dave Doust and Karen Price. We were actually at grad school together, but we didn't talk to each other for 20 years. And now our careers have kind of come back together, and we both work on the same issues. And so we've been working together for the last little while. I cannot make my slides go forward. So where are we going in this talk? I'm going to just give you an overview on the British Columbia landscape and what's really happening in the forests, and then why does it matter? British Columbia, even when you look at it from this kind of imagery, you can see why it's so diverse. British Columbia is the most diverse province in Canada, and it's got more diversity than most of Europe put together. The size of it is huge, and you can see right here that it's affected by the oceans. It's affected by the continental climate. We have massive mountain ranges, we have deserts, we have high elevation deserts. So we have this massive broad array of ecosystems, and it's 95 million hectares, which is double France and Spain, 4 times England. It's a big place. So about half of British Columbia is not treed at all. High elevation areas that have no trees, northern areas, but the rest of it is treed. And I have a technical problem that the words show up over my clicker. I don't know if you can do anything about that, technical person, because I can't actually move my slideshow on. Anyway, so this diversity of forested ecosystems is immense. Very different ecosystems, plateau country, coastal forests, bog forests, subalpine forests, low elevation ponderosa pine forests, basically desert forests. We have a lot here. And I think if you grow up here and have never really thought about it, you don't realize just how incredibly unusual this diversity is. And so why are we talking about old growth forests now? Well, we've actually been talking about old growth forests in British Columbia for the last 30 plus years. In the 80s, there was a lot of concern about the state of the forest. And in 1993, there was at that point the largest civil disobedience in Clayoquot Sound. And of course, that's now been overwhelmed by the largest civil disobedience at Fairy Creek that we're seeing now. And there's a huge amount of concern about the state of the forests. And, it almost wasn't an issue for 15 years in the middle there. And but now it's back, and it's very much an issue in British Columbia, both politics and otherwise. And there are very much two narratives happening. One is the concern about the state of the forest, and the other is, and I'm sorry if you can't see this very well, but it's just a picture that someone took as they were driving along the Pat Bay Highway that says British Columbia will never run out of old growth forests. And so there's these two stories that are out there. And so my little story that I'm telling you here starts in about 2019, where the province put out a summary on, they put it together a panel actually to look at the state of old growth. And they said some really kind of generalized things. They said the province is really big and there's about 13 million hectares of old growth out there. And that's all they said. And this is when I got back together with my colleagues, Dave and Can, and we said, okay, they've put together a panel to look at the state of old growth, but they've told them absolutely nothing. They've given them nothing to go on. And they're just going to run around the province and talk to people. And that's great. But they actually need some numbers behind them. They need to understand the state of the forest. So we wrote this report, and which is available on my website, which I can put in the chat later if you're interested. And we also published it in a peer-reviewed academic journal. And we basically assessed the condition of old forest across all the ecosystems of the province. And what we did is within each broad ecosystem, we distinguished the very small from the very big, tall forests. We're using a measure of site productivity. And we basically identified that there is a high risk to big treed old growth. And just to show you this in a bit of a graphic, what the little circles are on the left in the smallest section here. These are not very low productivity ecosystems that grow really small trees like these ones in this bog forest here. And on the right, these are highly productive ecosystems and they grow big trees like this. And when you break British Columbia up into categories like that, from smallest to largest trees, first of all, we see that the majority of the province is relatively unproductive. And that's not surprising. If you think of steep slopes, high elevations, those are not productive ecosystems. They wouldn't normally be able to grow really massive ecosystems. And the green in each of these shows you the proportion of each ecosystem that is old growth today. And so in the lower productivity types, we can see a relatively high level of old growth in those systems. But as we get into the more productive, we see there's very little old growth. And what we basically concluded was, of the remaining old forest in British Columbia, 80% of it is literally small trees for that ecosystem. And conversely, of the remaining old forest, about 8% is large trees, and about 3% is the very large trees. And these statistics started to get some press when we released this report a couple of years ago. We actually didn't understand the extent to which it would start to get press, but it did within the forestry world, and became a bit of an issue because we said, well, we're running out of the big treed forests. And we pointed out that when anybody says we have a lot of old growth, they are equating, they're making them the same, these little bog forests and the big forests that grow these splendid large trees. Neither ecosystem is better or worse than the other, but they are really different. And so if you put them all in the same bucket and say that they're all the same thing, then you're going to miss something. And that's what we were really pointing out in our work. So at the same time, as a result of this panel, these two guys, who are very much run-of-the-mill guys who have come through the forest industry, they've worked for the provincial government as district managers and as industry, within industry for years. They were commissioned by the government to look at the state of old growth, and they came up with 14 recommendations. And the primary thing that they said was, we've been doing a poor job of managing the forests, and we need to shift what we do. And they called it, we need a paradigm shift, they said. And they said we need to declare that conservation of ecosystem health and biodiversity is an overarching priority for how we manage. And they said we need to stop doing the words in blue, and we need to start doing the words in green. So we need to stop managing for timber, and we need to stop managing for ecosystem health. And they had a whole bunch of examples of that. And they said we needed to do that, and the government signed on to that recommendation. In fact, they signed on to all the recommendations in this report. And the other thing that they said we need to do is, they said some ecosystems are at incredibly high risk today, and we need to stop harvesting them for a short time. They call them deferrals. Defer harvesting, put that harvesting on pause until we figure out what we're going to do. How are we going to shift forest management in the province? So they made these recommendations, and then the government actually put together a panel, of which I was a member, to figure out what that meant. What did the deferrals mean? And I could talk about that in detail. Pretty much most of my slides are a talk of themselves. I'm not really going to talk about that. I'm going to really talk about, the whole context of what's happening here. But we created a map of the forests that, meeting their criteria, should be deferred from harvest. And that was the biggest treed old growth, ancient forests, rare or remnant ecosystems, and resilient forests. And we put together maps of these. And you can go on the provincial government website and see some background reports and maps of these forest types in the province. In November last year, the province announced this intention to defer harvest in 2.6 million hectares of forest, only if the local First Nation actively agreed, which caused some problems in itself in terms of implementation. There has been actually very little take-up of that provincially, and as I say, that's an entire other story at this point. But so, in one sense, there's that whole narrative is going on. There's a problem with how we're managing the forests. Independent panel has said we need to do things differently. And then there's the alternative voice. The alternative voice is the forest industry, the forest lobby, and it put out an alternative paper to ours and said, no, there's not 3% left, there's 30% left. We don't need to worry about the forest. And we wrote a paper on why their analysis is fundamentally flawed. And again, that's on my website. But the basic crux of the reason it's flawed is if you think of the population of trees as being a population of people. Now, we said that people over 6 feet are tall, and then we counted the number of tall people left, people being trees in this case. So we used that analogy. And then what the forest industry said was they used a different ruler, they used a different scale, and they just upped the numbers on their version of the scale and said, well, everybody over 6 feet is tall. And so suddenly they just had a lot more tall people. And that's literally the crux of how they come to say that there's way more big trees remaining in the province than we found. And at the same time, there's my world, and probably not yours, but my world is full of papers and things put out by a lobby that concludes that all is well with the forests of British Columbia, that there are no old forest concerns, that old forests will be here forever. This particular graphic put out by this guy shows that, in fact, we're increasing the amount of old growth in the province on an annual basis. I'm too polite, actually. I can't find what's the right word to put in there. It's rubbish is what it is. But we know that arguing about facts and numbers is a fruitless exercise. And how do we know? Well, because we've been doing it forever. This is what happens when we have a lobby that wants to keep doing what it's doing. We get out there information that suggests that all is well. It's the same with the climate. You know, the climate lobby has been phenomenally paid for, financed by the people who want to keep digging up oil. And this is what works in the world. And so it is problematic that denial is often a very successful strategy for not making change when change is needed to be made. And I have an entire other talk about how denial works and all the different phases of denial, which is kind of interesting. But it is very much a tactic used to avoid changing when we know we need to change. So, as I said, arguing about numbers is fruitless. We need to go back and remember that the two guys, Gary and Al, who wrote that report, they said the priorities that currently drive our forest management systems are backwards. Rather than determine what must be done to maintain ecosystem health and resilience, and then what we should get out of that, we constantly do it the other way around. We determine that we need this much timber, and therefore everyone else doesn't get managed for all the habitat pieces. And I'm just going to show you a little bit of a graphic in terms of how it's easy to get different pictures of the state of the forests by presenting it in different ways. So this is an image of the south end of Vancouver Island. And this shows you old growth mapped using provincial data in green. And, you know, I look at that and you probably look at that and go, it looks pretty good. We don't have a problem. What's the problem? Well, so what Karen, Dave, and I did is that we took every ecosystem, low elevation ecosystems, high elevation ecosystems, for the whole province, and we broke it down into trees, into the size of the trees. And there is a kind of incredible provincial inventory that allows us to do that, called Vegetation Resources Inventory. And we literally, for every ecosystem, took the size of the trees in the data from very small to very large and mapped them in these 5 categories. So now you can actually go on the provincial website and find a map of old growth ordered by size of trees. So you can really see where the big trees are and where the little trees are. And there is a bit of a space on the end of this graphic because, of course, we've harvested most of the original many of the original big trees, that's the first thing that got harvested. So we have what is called a sliding baseline here, where what we have left today doesn't represent what was there originally. That is always a problem in science, and it's why the codstocks had their problem. And because we have a tendency to just manage what we have today instead of remembering what was there yesterday. Anyway, that's it. Sorry, a momentary aside. So this map, same map we just saw, is the old growth on Vancouver Island, ordered by tree size, with the very lightest colors with the little trees and the darkest colors in dark green. And just so that you can see them better, I've made the small and the very small trees into blue. And so in the darkest green, this right here that you can see, this area is the wall brown, and it has really big trees in it, and it comes up on the map as being really dark green. And these areas, all of this blue up here, you can see it on the map in the sense of it's high elevation forest, and you can see that they started logging down here, and all of this hillside is logged all the way up. These are the newest clear cuts, but all the forest in between is logged. And the old growth that's left is this stuff on the tops of the mountains. And if you've ever been hiking to the tops of mountains, you know that they're not big. They're not big forests up there for lots of reasons. So this shows you old growth broken down into the size of the trees. And I don't know if you can see the difference. I'm just going to flip between them a little bit. If I show you just the very small and the small trees here, and then the medium on this one, you can see that you pick up even a significant proportion of those trees are in the bottom three size classes. And when you put medium in there, you're covering most of the remaining old forest. And the flip side of this conversation is what has been harvested. What I just turned on there, and I'll just do it again so that you can see it, in the orange tan, these areas were logged between 80 and 140 years ago in general. And these areas were logged that I just added between 40 and 80 years ago. And when I add in the most recent harvesting, so these are forests that are 0 to 40 years old, you can see that the context of the remaining old growth is in a pretty impressive sea of harvested landscape. And on this map, we actually have some quite large parks in here and on the coast further north, but we don't have a lot of intact old forest, big old forest. And when I show you then the very small and small trees in blue and the harvested, you can really see that the remaining big old forest is hard to find on southern Vancouver Island. If I go through a similar exercise anywhere in the province, the story is the same. And it's almost an aside in the sense of, a lot of the conversation today is about, in my world, is about protecting old growth. And I know a lot of people are really concerned about that. But one of the key things that we actually have to do is we've gone so far from the natural condition in many, particularly southern and low elevation places in the province, that one of the key things we need to do is actually start to look at these older second growth and allow some of that to recover into the old growth of the future. Because in many ecosystems, like these drier forested ecosystems on the east side of Vancouver Island, the southern mainland, the mainland coast, we are down to 1, 2, 3, 5, 10% remaining old forest, depending on the specific ecosystem. And if we want, and naturally those systems would have 50, 60, 70% old growth. And we've moved very far from the natural condition, and that puts all those ecosystems at risk. So if we want recovery over time, we need to do recruitment and restoration of the younger forest. So will we ever run out of old growth forest? Well, we probably won't. So, but I still give it an X because it's a meaningless statement. we have logged the vast majority of the original big forests in British Columbia, and that matters from an ecological perspective. Just as an aside, since we're there and looking at it, this is an image of Fairy Creek on southern Vancouver Island. And just so that you can see the kind of the same imagery, this is some original mapping that we did to look at the size of the forest again. So old growth in Fairy Creek, and you can see that a lot of the remainder of the old growth around there is the small stuff, and Fairy Creek is on the larger end of what's remaining. And if I switch on the harvesting map, you can see everything in yellow, tan, and orange has been harvested. The original estuaries were harvested 100 plus years ago, and then the main slopes were harvested 40 to 80 years ago, and then we've picked out the remainder of the pieces over the last 40 years and harvested up to the edges of Fairy Creek, and that's where that sits today. So why is any of this important? Well, again, each of these slides could be an entire talk. There are clearly ecological, spiritual, cultural values within old growth forests. Some of the things that I work on more are climate mitigation issues around carbon and climate adaptation around resilience. And I'll talk a little tiny bit more about those in a minute. But these forests are at risk because they are completely irreplaceable. When they're gone, they're not coming back, especially with climate change. And they're at risk because we do harvest them and we don't intend to replace them. So, harvesting takes a 500-year-old forest and then shifts back and logs the trees then in an 80 or 100 or 120-year rotation, but has no intention of ever letting the forest grow back to that age. And these forests are at risk because the policy to protect them is not good, has never focused on these forests because they're worth a lot of money from a timber perspective. And the forest has, the policies have been very poorly implemented. And this is what the Merkel-Gawley report said. We need to do this better. We need to change how we do this. So just a little go back to the forest itself. These two pictures are of old growth forest in the same ecosystem with tiny shaw pine and massive spruce trees. This difference matters from a carbon perspective, from a biodiversity perspective, and to the services that ecosystems provide. So it's not that big treed forests are more important fundamentally, but they are highly at risk, and so they're critical to defer. Big treed old growth, and actually small treed old growth to some degree too, is an incredible carbon bank. These big treed forests have some of the highest stores of carbon in forests in the world, up to 1,000 tons a hectare. And when you walk through old growth, pretty much everything you see is storing carbon. The ground beneath your feet, it can be meters deep of carbon storage. And around 60% of the carbon that is stored in these forests is actually underground. So when you look at a massive tree, think that there's more carbon beneath your feet. And when these forests are logged, around 60% of the carbon that is in the soil is immediately released into the atmosphere. We pay no heed to that. It's not accounted for provincially or globally in the carbon accounting systems. And but keeping these forests standing is actually critical to meeting our emissions targets around climate change. And these forests are a biodiversity hub. They are interdependent communities of organisms that have lived together for so long that they've formed these webs, and they communicate and they share resources. Anybody who's read Suzanne Simard's book is getting a sense of that. We learn more and more about these forests the more we look. They're amazingly complex. They can recognize their kin. Big trees recognize their little kin who are related to them. These are mind-blowing concepts to me, who have been studying this stuff forever. The legacy of thousands of years of not being disturbed is phenomenal and indescribable. And we're logging these forests to the very end. Ancient forests, the really, really old ancient forests. They're just old growth forests. They're just really old. But some of these forests are as old as Greek libraries. They are thousands and thousands of years old and have been, we have forests in this province that generated as the glaciers receded 10,000 years ago, and the forest itself has not been disturbed since that time. These are globally rare, phenomenal ecosystems, and we have a poor sense of where they are. And but we do know that there are individual trees in these ecosystems that are multiple thousands of years old, and that the whole ecosystem hasn't been disturbed for 5,000 to 10,000 years. We don't manage for those ecosystems. We have nothing in policy that protects those ecosystems currently. And so, and as I said, the big tree, the general big treed old growth, there really is little left. This image here is just a satellite image of looking at a coastal landscape, and you can see where the valley was because the yellow here are all the cut blocks. And we have very effectively logged the bottom of pretty much every valley in British Columbia. And this kind of graphic shows you it's the same idea as I showed you early on, that if you look at the trees that are really small and you look at the trees that are really big, in terms of how much is left, we have lots of little trees, but we have very small percent of the original large forests remaining. Originally in British Columbia, we had about 25 million hectares of old growth. Today, we have about 11 million hectares. In our analysis, we actually, when we updated the provincial data sets, and these figures are agreed to by the provincial government, and they're in our technical report that's on the web. Today, the remaining very old, very large old is very small. And you can argue about whether this is twice this much or not. It is a tiny proportion of what was there originally, and it's a tiny proportion of the current old growth today. And we have a policy that's looking for saying we should defer harvest. Well, this was the amount that we suggested should be deferred as kind of an emergency measure, but only a tiny fraction of it has actually been deferred to date. It's interesting to look at the historic context of this. This is a Maclean's article, and I'll just read you a little bit. Maclean, he gave the people of BC a 350-acre stand of superb fir giants bordering the Alberni Highway in Vancouver Island. Its name is Cathedral Grove. These firs are neither the island's biggest nor the oldest. That's the Maclean's article. It was written in 1958. So at that point, we had logged most of the big, amazing Douglas fir in those ecosystems. Today, the coastal Douglas fir ecosystems have less than 1% old growth remaining. We still harvest these trees. This is Big Lonely Doug in a clear cut. There were 2 trees left of this size. These trees are not as big as the ones in Cathedral Grove, but this tree is 230 feet tall, and it would have been harvested if a forester hadn't decided that they really couldn't harvest it. But trees like this are harvested all the time. Why do we care? Well, we should care for all kinds of reasons, but this is one reason we should care: the climate crisis, which is very, very real, and we keep being distracted from it. Forests are the primary source of carbon emissions in this province, bigger than energy. We don't account for it. We have to start to think about forests in how we do this accounting work. And the twin crises of climate and biodiversity, the rate of extirpation or the rate of extinction across every known species has shot through the roof over the last 100 years. And that is as we've taken over technological industrialization and mowed down the array of habitats that are out there. So, I mean, that's why we need to care. There's lots of other reasons, of course. And, you know, the other side of the story is, of course, that harvesting of old forest in this province maintains jobs and communities. There's a picture of telephone pole here because it's about a cubic meter. Well, British Columbia has the lowest jobs per cubic meter in Canada and in the Western world. We have less than 2 jobs that get generated for every cubic meter of wood that is chopped down. The local Proctor Mill, where I live, gets about 9 jobs per cubic meter, and they have a value-added facility. Other value-added facilities, there's a few of them in BC, but largely not. Largely, we have a high volume industry, and a phenomenal amount of wood gets shipped, not just as raw logs, but as sawn timbers. One company, for instance, ships its cedar that it logs on Vancouver Island to New Zealand and gets it finished there, and then it comes from New Zealand back to the eastern United States to be sold as really high value clear cedar trim. And you know, I don't know what planet we're on, but that doesn't make any sense. This is a Canfor mill that deals in high volume. It's actually a new mill that just was purchased in South Carolina by Canfor. So, you know, unfortunately, we're mismanaging the forests, and we're not producing jobs anywhere like the amount of jobs that we could be providing. And this is what industrial transition is about. We started to talk about it in the 1990s, and we haven't, then we stopped for about 20 years, and now we're back talking about it, but it's what we need to do. So I'm nearly done here. Managing for timber doesn't work, and managing for ecosystem health with some special management areas takes care of most of the other values. Frankly, industry transition is inevitable, as logging 1,000-year-old or even 250-year-old trees never was a sustainable activity, and yet we pretend like it is. In my view, we won't be talking about anything but carbon in 20 years from now, or, you know, there are segments of society who really understand this now, but as the sea level rises, the sea level is forecast to rise a foot by 2050. Like, that is a lot of water. That is a lot of places underwater. We will start to take this seriously. The graphic shows the contribution of forest harvesting and wood issues to the carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in BC, not accounted for currently. And we play all these games around, you know, the idea that we're sucking up, we cut down the forest, but we put it into 2x4s, and so that's okay, right? But it's not. We release a huge amount of carbon when we do that. And it's really not dealt with adequately at the moment. It's part of that whole denial obfuscation question that comes up. And we could have all kinds of beautiful British Columbia really is that. We can have alternatives. We can have leadership on carbon. There are places where selling carbon credits are an option. There's a huge interest in that, but there's no mechanism to get us there in this moment. Tourism is the global future, although it might not be with climate change going forward, but we can develop alternative economies. We have to develop alternative economies, and we have only just, you know, broken the lid on that, starting to do it. I think the bottom line is that if we managed for ecosystem health, as the Goldgrowth Strategic Review report said we must, that will take care of most of these values. And we have to take that seriously and put it first. But if half of the players are still in the denial mode, it doesn't matter what we put in place. We have dodged and weaved managing, dealing with this issue for all my career in British Columbia. And we're still in that mode, and it really is about, it's now that we have to decide. So, you know, the province puts out these we're taking care of the forests. And so, and they are starting to have these conversations, but so little has actually happened to date. There's a lot of talk and a lot of angst and a lot of hand-wringing, but we're still logging these most important forests, and we haven't changed anything. The policy hasn't changed. We haven't put protections in place for these forests. We really have done very little. In terms of the deferrals, there's mediocre implementation at best. We have not changed any policy to protect these best areas for recovery and recruitment. We don't account correctly for carbon, and switching it so that we plan for resiliency we haven't started to do anything on that front, although we talk about it a lot. And so this is the time that we need to use our voices and decide, frankly, which way we're going. We have a choice, and that's where I will end it today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. That was a lot to take in and heartbreaking, which is exactly what I hoped you would do, is give us all the hard facts so we can stop sticking our head in the sand. We already have some questions in the Q&A. Are you okay if I dive right in?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, so from Odette Auger, the question, are 30% by 2030 conservation targets enough?
No, probably not. But I'm worried more by the fact that that those generic numbers can be applied well and effectively, or they can be applied poorly. So, for instance, you saw my first slide that showed the 95 million hectares of British Columbia, 50% of which is pretty much not forested. So you can protect 50% of British Columbia and not save a tree. And that analogy continues across the board, right? So what we have to do is protect the right 30%. If we protected the right 30% by 2030, then yes, it would be a very solid move, because every ecosystem in every valley bottom across the province, the dry interior Douglas fir, the dry interior cedar hemlock, the coastal Douglas fir, all those low elevation ecosystems, all of them have less than 5% protected right now. And I say less than 5 so that someone can't tell me I'm wrong. The number is less than 1% for most of those ecosystems. And yet we have around 45% of the alpine protected. So it's that skew that is the problem. So if we put the protection in the right places, it can do a phenomenally good piece. But that's why what I'm talking about actually really matters, because the forest industry already says we've protected, or we don't want to harvest 75% of the old forest. And they say that because they didn't have a plan to log the little tiny trees that are my size. And so it's just getting it right that really matters. And so, yes, I commend the 30 by 30 numbers, but it really does have to be the right areas.
Great answer. Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that call for specificity. Odette has a follow-up question. I've heard only 20% of BC's forests are remaining old growth, and 2/3 of that is unprotected. Based on the provincial definition for old growth, greater than 250 years old on the coast and 180 years old in the interior. The question is, what are the other indicators of old growth, and how does that impact the numbers of remaining trees?
Right. Well, there are multiple answers to that. When we first did our analysis, there were about 13 million hectares of old growth in the data set. And that's of about a 50 million total forested-ish. So you could work out the percentage overall. And when we did our analysis, recent analysis for the ministers, when we just updated the data in terms of fires and harvesting that hadn't been put into the data set by the province, we lost 2 million hectares. So the official total right now is 11 million hectares total. And like I said, the crucial part though is any big number is meaningless. And what we need to do is, you're exactly right. And I think where you're leading is those age definitions are somewhat meaningless. They're actually quite effective in general, but I spent the first 10 years of my career running around in the forest, actually looking at the attributes of the forest, like looking at how many big trees there were, how many dead big snags, how many big pieces of coarse-wooded debris. We can look in that detail, and I know lots of companies, for example, are doing that. But if they don't understand what the goal is, like that's the problem, is to me, we know how to do this, but we haven't. Like we know how to identify the best forest. You can tell right here, this example, it's the Fenger Memorial forest. It's the size of my garden, this little tiny piece of old growth right here in the Lardo. It's the only bit left of old growth in that part of low elevation. It's really obvious that it's old growth. You don't have to fight too hard to figure that out. So, and at the same time, there is little treed old growth that's right next door. So that is protected. I feel like I'm not answering the question now, I'm sorry, but we can go into these stands and do as much analysis as we want around attributes of old growthness. I have piles of papers on it that have been around for 20 years. If we go out of our way to not protect these most important areas, which is what we currently do, then all the science doesn't matter. We have a disconnect between the science and the policy, and that's where I work, like trying to bring these two things together. So yes, the age definitions are kind of lousy, but they're really helpful at a strategic level. And we need to decide if we are going to actually keep these most important forests or not. And then we know how to find them if we decide we want to keep them.
Right. So it comes back to what you said a few slides back about if we continue with denial, it really doesn't matter what rules we make.
Exactly.
Chero Neville asks, what does sustainable forestry look like to you?
Yeah, really good question. It looks like taking your landscape, whatever that is, could be the West Kootenays, it could be a big valley, and making sure that the things that need protecting are protected first. So we know in general that when you're close to the natural condition of an ecosystem, you have a high chance of keeping the functions intact. And so, on the coast, for example, we know that a low risk scenario is keeping about 70% of the natural amount of old growth. So we have good science that leads us to setting targets for retention. Our current provincial targets they're off the screen, they're so low, but we know the science targets that are needed. So you get those and then you apply them to the landscape in a representative way so that you have actually protected the right proportion of productive, big, old forest sites. You actually can't find any, so you can't, they're hard to protect right now. But yes, you protect those and you can protect the small stuff too, but you have to make sure that that's representative. And the forestry itself needs to be done in a precautionary way. The Old Growth Strategic Review basically recommended we move 100% away from clear-cut harvesting and we manage partial harvesting. And if we do that, we have to radically reduce the harvest level. We have to reduce the allowable annual cut. And if we did those things, we put reserves in place sufficient that you can have landscape connectivity from valley bottom to mountain top and along ridges, then we start to allow ecosystems to adapt to climate change. We maintain water flow. If we stop clear cutting, then when it rains like the dickens, like it did, the soil doesn't get washed away and take out the highway. You know, we know how to do this. We've known how to do it for 40 years. We just don't do it. And we need to manage for fire resilience. We could thin all the forest. In my view, nothing should be clear cut harvested pretty much ever. There's no ecosystem that naturally is responding to a clear cut. Even a fire doesn't burn everything, right? So we need to leave the fire resilient trees, thin the fuel load so that fires can't move in the same way that they do now, and maintain it so that the forests get to pick up the water as it falls out of the sky and manage the rate of runoff. Those changes, so if we went to partial harvesting everywhere, 50% retention of the rest of the forest in a representative way, and lower the harvest level, and make sure that the majors don't run off with all the wood, and that the value added people actually can get the wood, so that we could have more jobs. We could have more jobs in the province than we do now if we did those things. There you go.
Yeah. From Helen Davis, the government's data for forest lumps everything greater than 250 years into one group. A 250-year-old forest is very different than a 900-year-old forest. It prevents us from meaningfully managing for wildlife that requires large trees. For example, save BC bear dens. This is more of a statement than a question.
Yes, well, I agree. And, you know, in the data, there is resolution. There is more resolution. You know, the province says everything over 250 is old, and they don't differentiate. When I worked on developing the Great Bay Rainforest, we recommended that we say, you know, we need a target for forests over 1,000 years, and we need a target for forests over 500 years, and one for over 250 years. So I totally agree. This current shift that we've seen, that may or may not be a shift, should we decide to shift with the shift, does acknowledge ancient forests, which we defined on the coast as greater than 400 years old. And we did map all the ancient forests that are in the database, but we know that's underrepresentative of what's actually there. So if you go onto the Provincial website for old growth deferrals, you'll see our little report, Old Growth Technical Advisory Panel. There's a bunch of information about that kind of thing in there.
Great. Charo says, we have an area in Kelly Richardson's exhibition area for writing to your MLA or MP. What would you recommend we say to our political leaders?
Get on with it. Like, they've already said what they're going to do, right? So they have already, thank you for laughing. They have already committed to implementing recommendations that increase the targets, that defer harvest of the best old growth, that stop clear cutting. You know, they've already said they're going to do all these things, and we're now how far into the mandate, and nothing has happened. And there's a lot of game playing, and I think there's a lot of good intention, but yeah, they need to actually get on with it. They need to, well, you know, I've worked with government and government staff for a long time, and like everywhere, the people are split, right? Some people think their job is to do a good job and be a professional forester, or implement these things that the government has said that they're going to do. Other people think it's their job to protect the forest industry. And there's a huge amount of that happens within the bureaucratic regime. I see it every day. I see the frustration from all the people who don't want it to be like that. But that's the reality. And the political government has said we're going to do this, but they are not necessarily supported by the people in your regional offices. Yeah. Who for the last 30 years, their job has been in their minds to maintain the harvest level and not to make these shifts. So I don't know how we do that. I know government is thinking about how do you actually create a mindset shift. It takes a long time to do that. I see You know, I'm deeply cynical, whatever. I work on this stuff all the time. I expect to fail. I see a shift, a broad shift in the conversation, like climate. So I'm going to try and say something positive. I worked on climate issues for 30 years. It was dire, truly dire. It's still dire, but the conversation has shifted. I no longer have to phone the CBC in a rage when they forget to mention that the thing that just happened was probably climate change. So that now we have changed the narrative, and we collectively, socially, if that is the key thing that we need to do. I think the narrative is changing around forests in British Columbia, and it is very divided, but I know an awful lot of foresters who agree with me, although they might not be brave enough to say so. They're often not. But there is a shift, and so it literally is we have to do this. We just have to get on with it. Rambling answer.
One of the questions in here touches on some of those same points from Gary Worth. The Liberals gave most of the forests to industry in 2003, before and after. The NDP hasn't fixed much in the last 5 years. Who is going to fix this? Corporations have a lot of lobby effect.
Us, the people.
Yeah.
I mean, it is true, right? I said, at the bottom of that other slide, we have to keep the voice, has to be there. It's very frustrating. I mean, I work on the inside of it. It's really frustrating. I see that people do want to make shifts. I think there is somewhat of a movement towards this shift within the province's white paper that they put out. It's not particularly thrilling, but they have to know that people will still vote for them if they do these things. I mean, that's the bottom line. So in fact, writing to your MLA and supporting them in this is really, really critical. They, of course, like every government in our poor system, are at that whim. Like, they're not going to do things that they think mean that they're going to lose the next election. And so they watch the media battle, and they want to know how well it's going. And so if you don't use your voice, you don't have a voice. And that is the only thing that I can say to people is just to let folks know that they do care about this. It's not futile. It feels futile writing those cards, writing in and saying this thing, rebutting stupid articles in the newspaper. It's tiresome. It's really important, because that's what social civil engagement is, and nothing changes without us doing that.
Yeah. I have one last question. I recognize we're at 3 o'clock. Are you okay for one more?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. From Edie Petrosian. Rachel, many folks are aware of the coastal forests that are at risk. Can you speak to some of the lesser known but very at-risk old growth forests?
Thanks, Eddie. Yeah, for sure. It is interesting, there's so much focus on the coast and Vancouver Island. Here in the Kootenays, for example, we have the world's only inland temperate rainforest, with mountain caribou that are dwindling faster. They're high up on that rate of extinction curve, disappearing before our eyes, and populations shrinking. We have the same kind of absolutely ancient cedar forests. Actually, I mean, this one on the screen here is in the Kootenays. We have very little left, and they are being harvested really significantly, and they get much less attention. What we're doing in the interior a lot is shifting towards pellets. Like, some of these forests are actually being harvested and turned into pellets that are then shipped to Europe and used to offset their emissions. Which is mind-blowingly twisted, but not the question. That's another entire other question, other talk. So, the Kootenays, for example, has the most diverse forest types in the province. We have ancient larch stands. We have, big ponderosa pine forest that there is basically none remaining of. we turned most of the ponderosa pine ancient forests into railroad tracks, but there are, those ecosystems need recovery strategies for sure. And so right now, a big fight is in the wet belt interior around from Prince George south through the Robson Valley down into the Kootenays, where ancient forest remains and is really not protected well. And so that is a key thing. There's a lot of diversity in there that I could speak to if we had another hour. But it's totally true that there tends to be a focus to think that all the big forest is on the coast, and that's not right. There's a huge amount of diversity in the interior that gets much less attention.
Well, this has been incredible. I'm so grateful to you sharing your extensive expertise here and really highlighting the urgency and empowering us, saying we have power with our voices, which is helpful. That's great. We are at 3:04, so I'm going to wrap us up for the night or the afternoon. Thank you to everyone who's come here. We are recording this today. I'll take a couple of days to edit it and then get it up on our website. So share it with your friends, share it widely, get everyone to pay attention to all of this. And also I'd just like to bring your attention to a talk that we're having next week, next Tuesday at 2 p.m. with Angela Kane and Sarah Dixon Hoyle. Angela Kane's the CEO of the Secwepemc Restoration and Stewardship Society, and they'll be talking about Indigenous fire stewardship, land stewardship, and recommendations for going forward. You can register on our website at kag.bc.ca. Thank you all.
Thank you.